Hello, I'm Shane M. Nygaard, and welcome to Maria Callas, the voice that sought its ancestors. This is a Mythic Currents video. Opera legend Maria Callas is remembered as one of the greatest voices of the 20th century, but her voice seemed to carry more than musical brilliance. It carried longing, command, grief, fire, and an almost ancestral gravity. This presentation follows Callas through the lens of Pluto, not as a simple biography, but as a descent into root, memory, body, and artistic destiny. Her voice seems to have had its own magnetism. Through opera, it reached toward something older than personality, toward forgotten heroines, buried repertoire, and the deep lineage of the art form itself. Callas did not merely rise into fame. In the language of James Hillman from the Soul's Code, we can say she grew downward into depth. And through that descent, the voice that sought its ancestors became ancestral. Callas's voice was not famous because it was conventionally beautiful. It was famous because it was unforgettable. It could be severe, wounded, imperious, tender, ecstatic, and terrifying, sometimes within the same phrase. It carried not only sound, but character, memory, and fate. This is why Callas feels Plutonic. Her voice reached below the surface of music into grief and longing and power and ancestral depth. It sounded as though something old was trying to return through her. The voice was not merely an instrument she possessed. It had its own magnetism, as if it were drawing her and the operatic world around her down into deeper roots. Before we turn directly to Callas, we begin with Pluto. Not because Pluto explains everything, and not because a single placement defines a life, but because Pluto gives us the symbolic language for the kind of depth Callas carried. Pluto is the force that works beneath the surface. It governs what is buried, inherited, denied, forgotten, or waiting to be transformed. It does not move in straight lines. It pulls downward and inward. It asks us to descend before we can understand. In Callas's life, Pluto does not appear as a neat psychological question. It appears as pressure, as intensity, as a force drawing her deeper into the material of not only her own life, but also the deeper memory of opera. For someone like Callas, whose art carried obsession, extremity, and the unmistakable presence of the underworld, Pluto becomes a map. It gives us a way to speak about what maybe cannot be spoken directly. In the mythic imagination, the underworld is not simply a place of punishment. It is the realm of soul. It is where life becomes image, where the dead become symbols, where what has vanished from the literal world continues to live in another form. This is essential for understanding Callas. Opera itself belongs to this terrain. It is full of ghosts, dead composers, vanished eras, archetypal women, inherited stories, old wounds, and passions too large for ordinary speech. When an opera singer steps into a role, she enters a world where the dead speak again. Through voice, image returns to breath. Through performance, the past becomes present. This is Plutonic art, art as threshold. In Callas, opera's underworld became audible. Through her voice, the past did not remain past, it returned. Opera is one of the great entrances into the imaginal underworld. Its stories are not small. Its characters do not merely feel, they are consumed. They love, curse, betray, they sacrifice and murder and grieve, and they die in heightened symbolic form. This is why opera was the perfect terrain for Callas. She did not belong to an art form of restraint. She belonged to an art form where the human body becomes a vessel for archetypal force. The stage became a threshold. The score became a kind of ancestral script. And Callas, with that singular voice and that almost frightening dramatic intelligence, became the medium through which forgotten emotional worlds could live again. We could say the dead sang again. So Callas's beginning is famously uncertain. Her birth information is given a DD, dirty data, Rodden rating, with conflicting birth records and more than one possible birth date. Yet the commonly referenced date is tends to be December 3rd, 1923, in New York, New York at 6 o'clock a.m. Symbolically, this uncertainty matters. Her origin is already rather veiled. Her story, we could say, begins in shadow. So we work with what is consistent across the possible dates and times. Across the possible charts, Pluto retrograde in Cancer remains central, along with its square to Chiron in Aries and trine to Uranus in Pisces. Together, these suggest ancestry, wound, genius, and a life drawn toward what lies beneath the surface. Pluto retrograde in Cancer speaks of ancestral hunger. Cancer is cardinal water, the tide that pulls us toward origin, toward family, body, memory, and the emotional truth beneath the surface. But Pluto intensifies everything it touches. It does not allow the family story to remain simple. It exposes the wound inside the root. For Callas, belonging was not simple. The family story could not easily contain the magnitude of her gift. The mother was not necessarily nourishment in her case. Her body, not necessarily home. So the voice found deeper roots elsewhere, in opera, in discipline, in forgotten works, and in the great ancestral forms of music and drama. Pluto's square to Chiron retrograde in Aries introduces pain as a force of becoming. Aries brings fire and courage. It brings defiance and the will to exist. In Callas, the wound did not remain passive. It pressed forward. It demanded form. Her wound demanded action, courage, and defiance. She was not built to simply endure quietly. Something in her had to fight its way into existence. This is part of what gives her performances their danger. Callas did not merely portray women in extremity. She understood extremity. She knew something about survival, rupture, and the fierce necessity of becoming oneself under pressure. The trine from Pluto to Uranus in Pisces electrifies her chart. Uranus signifies genius, originality, and breakthrough. Pisces opens the oceanic field of feeling, imagination, music, and dissolution. Together, they suggest an artist capable of translating emotional intensity into startling, creative brilliance. This is what we could say is the lantern Callas carried through the underworld. Her genius did not bypass pain, it illuminated it. She could take what was overwhelming and give it form through voice, technique, and dramatic intelligence. The result was not merely vocal power, it was like revelation. She made audiences feel that the emotional truth of the role had suddenly become visible, or rather, audible. So here we go with Pluto retrograde in Cancer, however, we cannot ignore the mother. For Callas, her relationship with her mother, Evangelia, was marked by exploitation, criticism, and betrayal. Maria's natural gift for singing was seized upon early, turned into a tool for family survival and ambition. This matters because Callas's voice did not emerge from a protected childhood. It emerged from pressure. It emerged from being used and judged and pushed. The gift became entangled with survival before it could become art. The biological root was wounded. Yet through opera, Callas found other roots: teachers, roles, composers, traditions, and the dead who could hold what family could not. Pluto in Cancer also brings us to the body. Cancer's symbol, the crab, gives us the image of the hard shell and the tender interior. The protective structure, the body, built around vulnerability, the inner world of tenderness. Callas did not feel at home in her body. She described herself as an ugly duckling, and this wound was reinforced by comparison, criticism, and her mother's preference for her sister. Later, Callas transformed her body dramatically and emerged as one of opera's great icons of glamour. But this transformation should not be reduced to vanity. In the symbolic logic of her life, the body became a vessel. The voice needed an image. The soul needed a form strong enough to carry the myth. The ugly duckling became the swan is not merely a makeover story. It is the remaking of the vessel. The body had to become capable of carrying the voice, the image, the myth, and the destiny. Callas's depth required discipline. In Athens, she trained with Elvira de Hidalgo, who taught her the full bel canto, beautiful voice, technique. Smooth phrasing, agile runs, breath mastery, and an even, ornamented tone. This is where Pluto and Uranus becomes somewhat practical, if we could say that such a thing. Genius alone is not enough. Depth alone is not enough. Callas studied obsessively. She worked for long hours. She watched, she listened, she absorbed, analyzed, and refined. Mid century opera tended to be static, singers standing still and delivering beautiful notes. You can imagine, with Pluto in Cancer, square Chiron in Aries, Callas changed that. Her technique became the foundation for dramatic embodiment. She did not sing emotions as decoration. She made the entire role breathe, move, suffer, and remember. Through Plutonic descent, Callas discovered forgotten corners of the operatic world, resurrecting difficult bel canto works that had been buried and forgotten. These operas were not dead because they lacked power. They were buried because they demanded too much. And Callas could meet that demand. She had the technique, the emotional extremity, the intelligence, and the dramatic courage to enter them fully. Bellini's Norma, Cherubini's Medea, Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, and Rossini's The Barber of Seville became newly alive through her artistry, the power of Pluto. She was not simply singing old works. She was reviving the dead. Through her, forgotten operas rose from the underworld and re-entered the living repertoire. In today's world, even those only tangentially familiar with opera likely recognize a title like The Barber of Seville, thanks to Callas. Callas's greatest roles were women forged in extremity. Norma, Medea, Tosca, Lucia, Alceste. These are not merely characters. We could say they are archetypal states. The betrayed priestess, the vengeful mother, the desperate lover, the unraveling maiden, the woman who willingly crosses into death. These roles mirrored Callas's Plutonic nature. They are women who reach beyond ordinary life, who cross thresholds, who confront powers larger than themselves. Callas did not soften them into prettiness. She gave them danger and dignity, intelligence, and soul. This is why her performances remain so charged. She made archetype audible. She did not simply interpret these women, she seemed to let them pass through her. And at the heart of Callas's story is Pluto in Cancer, Pluto retrograde in Cancer. Root, memory, mother, body, and ancestry. But the wound of origin did not remain only wound. Through opera, it became lineage. Through discipline, it became form. Through forgotten repertoire, it became resurrection. The voice that sought its ancestors found her truest ancestry through art, through Bellini, Cherubini, Donizetti, Rossini, Verdi, Puccini, and through the heroines who could bear its force. Callas grew down into opera's root system, and in time she became part of that ancestry herself. Thank you for joining me in this descent into Maria Callas's life, art, and ancestral mystery. Her story reminds us that the dead are not always silent. that memory does not merely belong to the past, and that art can become a vessel through which lost voices return. In Callas, longing became lineage, wound became sound, and the voice that searched for its ancestors became, in time, ancestral itself.